All right, let's do some trig review. The values at the top here, this can help you use your calculator in case you don't happen to remember the unit circle, since you'll have your calculator for the entire time. The trick is obviously not to write down decimal, but to write down the radical. The sine of pi over 6, you can put that in your calculator in radians, or you could switch it to degrees and put it into degrees, but the sine of pi over 6 is 1/2. Cosine of pi obviously over here, so cosine is -1. Remember, tangent is like slope. Flat slope is 0, up and down is undefined. So this is where the slope is 0, but this one is really undefined. Cosine of 45, that's first quadrant, so that's radical 2 over 2. Sine of 210, down here in the third quadrant, 30 degrees is the reference angle, so it'll be -1/2. Tangent of 315, this one is -1. Cosine of 2 pi, remember 2 pi is all the way around, so the cosine is 1. The sine of 3 pi over 2, 3 pi over 2 is this one, and that is -1. You'll be asked some questions about parts of a graph. Some tips on this. For the period, for tangent, remember period is pi over b, and b is the number in front of the x. So this one is simply just pi over 8. For sine and cosine, the period is 2 pi over b. Amplitude is the number right in front, that's your a. So here our amplitude is 2, and the period is 2 pi over 5. This says vertical shift. There is no vertical shift. This is supposed to say horizontal shift, which is left to right. Remember, the trick is if b is inside the parentheses, you would do c over b. Or remember, like with any graph, you can take the part in parentheses and set it equal to 0. So you would add pi and then divide by 2. So it's pi over 2, and because it's minus, it's right pi over 2. Minus in the problem, but positive when you solve it. Some more questions about the graph. The cosine graph, the parent graph. All right, it looks like this. It starts high, ends high, and then halfway it's low, and the zeros are on the pi over 2 intervals. So the y-intercept is at 1. Where does the sine equal 0? Just as a reminder, your sine graph has a 0 in the beginning, middle, and end, and then it has a maximum before it has a minimum. So the sine is equal to 0 at 0, pi, and 2 pi. That is because if you look at the interval, 0 would be included and 2 pi would be included. Where does the cosine equal 1? You can see it's right here, 0 and 2 pi. So even though that is basically the same location on the unit circle, it's because of the interval that you give both of those answers. Remember, those little tiny things matter when considering your choices. To find the exact solutions, that's exactly what that means. No decimals, and it looks like we're in degrees. And again, if you notice the interval, we're allowed to use 0 and we're allowed to use 360. So isolating the word, if we add 2, so 6 sine of x equals 12, divide by 6, we get that the sine of x equals 2. So here we're looking for an angle. So if you're going to type this in the calculator, you want to make sure you use the inverse. But as we know from the sine and cosine graph, it stays between -1 and 1, so nothing for sine would be that large. This one is no solution. For number 15, we want to get the words on one side, the numbers on the other. I'm going to subtract the 5. So we have 3 cosine theta minus 1 equals 5 cosine theta. And then I'm going to subtract the 3 cosine theta. I'm trying to keep my cosine positive. So -1 is equal to 2 cosine theta. And then we divide by 2. So -1/2 is where the cosine of theta is what we're looking for. You can go inverse second cosine 1/2. Or if you think through it a little bit, we do have to kind of consider where are the answers going to be. The calculator is bad at giving you the exact answer. So cosine is negative in the second and the third quadrant. This angle, the cosine is 1/2 at 60. So we would do 180 minus 60 and 180 plus 60. So 180 minus 60 is 120, and then 180 plus 60 is 240. So on a multiple choice question, just be careful. If you see just 120, like if this were the answer, that is a correct answer, but the correct answer is to pick them both and have 120 and 240. On the formula sheet, you will be given these formulas that you see up here at the top. So you're given the sum and difference formulas, and you're given the law of cosines. Whenever you see, actually they're telling you sum or difference identity, and they may not tell you that. They may not even say that, and they'll just say, find this. And you can see that the sign is on the outside of the parentheses. That does match the pattern for the formula. And so you can see the words go sine, cosine, cosine, sine. The angles go in order: first angle, second angle, first angle, second angle. And remember your symbols. If this is plus minus, it's also plus minus in the problem. The top goes with the top and the bottom goes with the bottom. So right in the middle we are adding. You do have to multiply these things together and then add the two parts. The sine of pi is 0, cosine of x, we don't calculate that. Cosine of pi is -1, and the sine of x, we can't calculate that either. So this is going to turn into a 0, so we get negative sine x. That's as far as that can be finished. Just to show you one with the cosine formula, the words obviously are up there. It goes cosine, cosine, sine, sine, and we fill this in with first angle is x, first angle, second angle, first angle, second angle. Now with the cosine, you can see it says plus minus, but in the middle it's minus plus. And again, top goes with top, bottom goes with bottom. So with cosine, if we're subtracting in the question, then we are adding right smack in the middle there. Again, we cannot calculate with a variable, but the cosine of pi is -1. The sine of x, we don't know, but the sine of pi is 0. So this is your 0 here, and we get negative cosine of x. That's clearly on the test. Be prepared to use those formulas. Now with this last one, it doesn't really tell you what to do. You cannot use sine, cosine, or tangent because it's not a right triangle. It is side, angle, side. So that means you can use the law of cosines. You can also use the law of cosines for side, side, side. Those are the two things you use the law of cosines for. So we're finding the missing side, this side right here. And you want to make sure you find that relationship. So whatever angle you know, you start with the side across from it. So x squared is equal to, so that follows our a, b, or c squared. You take the other two sides and square them and add together. The order doesn't matter. 160 squared plus 250 squared. Then it's minus 2 times these same two numbers times the cosine of your only angle, or the angle across from the missing letter or the missing side if you have more than one angle. Remember, when you type this in the calculator, we do take the square root. This will give you the answer right away. It says to round to 2 decimal places. So be careful with your calculator. You want to be in degrees. You want to make sure you square these numbers, and this is a minus from the formula. And then you can type it in exactly the way I have it written. You don't have to close any parentheses at the end. And the x will give you 224.82. And of course, this is in feet. Please pay attention to your units on problems where there might be units in the picture or in the description.